In the late 1950s and early 1960s, steam was enjoying its Indian summer as the much-loved Stephenson locomotive gave way throughout the world to the alien diesel and electric locomotives. In Great Britain, interest in railways was on the increase, and the then novel BBC television was persuaded that there was an audience for pure railway films, and so Railway Roundabout was born. For 5 years, from 1958 to 1962, Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams filmed, edited and produced films about all aspects of railways, presenting 10 25-minute shows a year at 5:30 in the afternoon, ostensibly for children, but in time for many adults to tune in. The films themselves were carefully retained and are now part of our national heritage, being held in the care of the National Railway Museum at York. The programmes which form this series of 5 have been prepared from those original films, so we can all once again relive the great days of the Railway Roundabout. As was the case in 1958, the first feature recorded by the Railway Roundabout team in 1959 was the closure of a group of railway lines, this time those emanating from Monmouth to both Ross-on-Wye and Chepstow. The first location visited was Ross-on-Wye, where the Monmouth Auto train left from the Bay platform. Pat Whitehouse and John Adams didn't attend on the last day of all, on which only an enthusiast special ran, but the day before, when the last normal service trains ran. This enabled them to record a number of trains, and of course to ride in the driver's compartment of one of the auto-trailers along the Wye Valley and through Symonds Yat Station. Today, much of the course of this line has been obliterated by the M50 motorway, for although it had many scenic attractions, the Wye Valley didn't attract many tourists and had few centres of population. The railway was losing £10,000 a year, and even the local bus services couldn't be made to pay. Monmouth was approached via a girder bridge over the River Wye, which turned to the south here towards Chepstow. Monmouth had 2 stations, the original Monmouth May Hill on the far side of the bridge, and Monmouth Troy, which was the junction for the other Wye Valley line to Chepstow. The standard locomotives on the Wye Valley lines were the Collet 1400 auto tanks and the familiar pannier tanks on the Chepstow line. Railway enthusiasts made up the majority of the passengers on this last weekend. Overnight snow was to present a different scene for the final day. On the Gloucester to South Wales main line, Chepstow was the junction station for the 13¾ mile branch to Monmouth, following the meandering Wye Valley. Originally, there'd been only 4 intermediate stations, but an effort to increase custom by the siting of 6 additional halts could not stem the tide of passengers deserting the railway. Redbrook was the last station before Monmouth and only had good sidings with no passing facilities. The line crossed and recrossed the River Wye and was consequently expensive to maintain. It was reported that this branch was losing £13,000 a year on passenger services alone, but it was to survive for a further 5 years for freight use only, and a small portion of the Chepstow end is still in use today, running to the stone quarry at Tydenham. Monmouth Troy had once been a through station, but the line through the tunnel to Pontypool Road had seen its last passenger services in May 1955. The pannier tank wasn't auto-fitted, so it had to run round. On this last day, all trains were specially strengthened, a single auto coach usually having sufficed. As the evening drew in, the last trains were prepared at Monmouth. The first of these to go was to Chepstow. Once the pannier had left, the 1400 tank was able to run round, as its 4-coach last train wasn't auto-fitted. Sadly, its departure couldn't be filmed as the light had gone. A relic of the Victorian era was the next target for Pat Whitehouse. The 240 wheel arrangement was effectively obsolete by the 1890s, but the Great Eastern Railway produced what was to become the last surviving type of this wheel arrangement in the 1890s. Known as intermediates, they were classified as E4 by the London and North Eastern Railway. Originally, there were 100 in the class, but by 1959, only this one survived in use as Cambridge's pilot. It had become something of a pet and was looked after by its crews with its bright work polished. The Cambridge University Railway Club had often hired it at weekends for use on the Milton Hall branch. The letters RA2 under its number signified that it had route availability number 2, which meant it could go on almost any lines. "82 of the engines had gone for scrap as long ago as 1940. But the 18 survivors remained intact until 1954, their light weight making them useful on many secondary routes, some of them migrating northwards from their familiar East Anglian territory. This engine, as the final survivor, was retained for preservation and today is part of the National Collection, restored to its original Great Eastern Royal Blue livery as number 490, but sadly not in working condition. The railway roundabout duo of Pat Whitehouse and John Adams were natives of the Birmingham area, and consequently they were well placed to film a special train organised by the local area group of the Stevenson Locomotive Society, which was to visit a number of lines in the Birmingham suburbs. The train was headed by one of the Midland Railway Class 2F060 tender engines, and the SLS's well-known Midlands Area Secretary, W.A. Cam Canwell, is seen affixing the headboard and talking to the Birmingham New Street station master before the train set out past a Jubilee. A second 2F brought up the rear of the train as the first destination was the Harborne branch, just a few miles to the west of New Street, which boasted a 1 in 66 gradient. The line had been conceived as a through route to the Halesowen branch at Lappel, but had been built as a 3.5-mile suburban branch. It had remained independent until 1922, although worked by the London and North Western Railway from the start, and had been highly successful. It was the best-paying suburban branch by far, and before the First World War had 27 trains each way daily. However, it was an early victim of bus competition and lost its passenger services during the economic depression of the 1930s on the 26th of November 1934. In those days, railways still carried a large proportion of freight traffic, and the little branch survived on this business until November 1963, a further 29 years. One of the factories served by the branch was the Chad Valley Toy Company, where they made Great Western jigsaw puzzles, amongst other things. Birmingham was served by 3 main railways, the London North Western, the Midland, and the Great Western. The latter's route to the southwest was joined to the North Western at Smethwick West Junction. The Great Western lines are in the foreground, to the left leading to Handsworth and Birmingham Snow Hill, whilst the line in the background, up which the SLS special is proceeding, was the connecting spur to the LNWR from New Street. This line remains in use today for services to Stourbridge, Kidderminster and Worcester. Halesowen was an important black country town which owed its growth to the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, it had been bypassed by the line to Stourbridge and had consequently been served only by a single line branch that ran between Old Hill on the Stourbridge line and the Midland Railway main line at Northfield, 6 miles to the north of Bromsgrove, to which a further line had been projected from Halesowen but never built. The station at Halesowen was at the foot of banks in both directions, the severe gradients necessitating banking engines. A third Midland 2F was provided to bank the special, which had arrived from the Old Hill direction. Halesowen station had not seen timetabled public trains since 1927, when trains from Old Hill had ceased. The line from Halesowen itself to the Midland Main Line was jointly owned by the Great Western and the Midland Railway, and had lost its passenger services as long ago as 1919, although the stations remained in good condition. This was because for nearly 40 years unadvertised workmen's trains continued to run, being provided by the Great Western from Old Hill to Longbridge, just short of the Midland Main Line, where the Austin Car Company had their works. These had been withdrawn in September 1958, but the line continued to carry freight traffic until 1964. The first crossing loop on the line was at Huntington, where Bluebird toffees are made. This is set at the top of the bank from Halesowen, and the banker was detached here. Finally, we see the special running through the complex of lines at the Longbridge Works. 3 shunting engines were kept here in the shed on the right. The next station on the Midland Main Line was Barnt Green, a junction for the cross-country branch line that served the important Worcestershire town of Redditch and bypassed the Lickey Incline to give a through route to Cheltenham and Gloucester via Evesham and Ashchurch. Coming off the main line at Barnt Green was a train from Birmingham New Street, headed by one of the famous Fowler compounds. This engine had been especially rostered for the cameras in order to make this film for Railway Roundabout. This shows how the railways cooperated with Pat Whitehouse and John Adams. By this time, Railway Roundabout had established itself on television and British Railways management was realizing the publicity value of a TV program, aimed as it was at both boys and adults. The live commentary given by Pat and John was tailored to have an educational benefit, and scenes were shot to illustrate various points, such as these of watering and handing over the token at Redditch. The railway was single line beyond the town, and only the driver in possession of the token was allowed to run his train over the stretch to which the token referred. This was and remains the standard practice for working single-line railways, although today the tokens are electronic signals rather than physical pieces of metal. The tokens were exchanged manually, either when the train was stopped in a station or, if not travelling too quickly, on the move. The token was put in a pouch attached to a large hoop, which then could be slipped over the engineman's arm. Each section of the railway between signal boxes would have a token or staff inscribed with the names of the section to which it applied. Various methods were adopted to synchronize the tokens with signalling and point work, but the most common took the form of a key, which could be inserted in a mechanical apparatus to unlock the appropriate levers to enable the train to proceed. The system in use here was known as token full block. The locomotive number 41157, built in 1925 by the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow, was cleaned up for its television stardom and worked the train for 2 days for the cameras. As mentioned earlier, it was built to the design of Sir Henry Fowler, the second LMS chief mechanical engineer, and the design was a development of Johnson & Dealey's Midland compound, first produced in the early 1900s. The onboard camera was in use on one run and captured the arrival at Broome Junction, a small country junction station where the former Stratford-upon-Avon and Midland Junction Railway came in from the east. This line had a colourful history, but the section from Stratford to Broome Junction was to close in 1960. It had lost its passenger services in 1947. The SMJ is seen disappearing behind the compound. Salford Priors was the next station after Broome Junction. Here Pat saw some road rollers rusting quietly away. Today they would attract as much attention as a locomotive. These engines were the first LMS express passenger engines and were soon hopelessly underpowered for the increasingly heavy mainline trains. They did much good work in Scotland and on former Midland lines, but were soon relegated to secondary work as the LMS caught up with modern Pacific and 460 designs for the principal duties. This cross-country line was usually worked by Fowler's large 264 tank engines, which had the same boiler as the compounds. At Evesham, the Great Western's Cotswold line to Worcester, known as the Old Worse and Worse, had its own station to the right of our train. The line had been transferred to the Western region upon nationalisation, and beyond Evesham was double track. A junction had been put in at Evesham to allow the route to be used as a diversionary line for Cheltenham to Honeybourne trains. The line was known as the Loop and rejoined the Midland Main Line at Ashchurch. It was used as an alternative route for freight trains avoiding the Lickey Incline, but was never engineered to express standards, becoming redundant in the 1960s as it duplicated both the Midland Main Line and the Great Western one via Honeybourne, the latter also being axed by Dr. Beeching. It closed to passengers in 1963, with freight finishing in the following year. Whilst number 41157 was destined for the scrap heap in 1960, the first of the line, number 41000, was destined to live on. Here we see her in her final British Railways guise at Crewe Works before being taken to Derby for a complete overhaul and restoration. Here she was subjected to an effective rebuild rather than a simple overhaul. It was not the first time she'd been rebuilt. The history of the Midland compounds is long and complicated. The Midland Railway's philosophy throughout its existence had been to run light, frequent trains, and to this end built a large number of moderately dimensioned locomotives for both passenger and freight use. This was carried through when heavier trains were required, the policy being simply to double-head these, a practice which other railways tried to avoid due to the staffing costs. Throughout the Victorian era, the Midland flew in the phase of orthodoxy, reintroducing single driving-wheeled express engines in the 1890s when other railways were using 440s, and introducing very small 440s in the early part of the 20th century when others were building 460s. However, there was a need for more powerful locomotives, but in Midland tradition, this need was met by increasing the power of the 440s rather than opting for larger engines. There was a practical side to this, as larger locomotives would be longer and necessitate changes to the railway infrastructure, notably in the provision of bigger turntables. The railway's chief mechanical engineer, Samuel Johnson, turned to the principle of compounding to get more power from his locomotives. In this, steam is used twice before exhausting to the atmosphere, at first in conventional small high-pressure cylinders, and then in larger diameter low-pressure cylinders. The system had been in use in Great Britain with varying degrees of success, notably by the Webb compounds of the London and North Western Railway, unsuccessfully, and didn't have a good reputation. Johnson's design was without doubt the most successful in Great Britain, and the first locomotive, number 2631, was built in 1901. The design was subsequently improved by his successor, Dealey, who added 40 to Johnson's total of just 5. 2631 was renumbered 1000 in 1907, and between 1914 and 1919, the original 5 Johnson engines were rebuilt to conform with the Dealey locomotives that were also being rebuilt with superheaters at that time. Thereafter, all the engines were effectively one class, and the magnificent number 1000, which emerged from Derby Works in 1959, was representative of the final Midland Railway express locomotive design, rather than an original Johnson engine. Number 1000 had been preserved as part of the British Transport Commission's collection, which was then housed at Clapham Museum in London. There was a movement at the time to preserve locomotives as working examples, which had been started in 1957 when the Great Western City-class engine, City of Truro, had been returned to steam after nearly 25 years as a static museum piece. It's interesting to note that while number 1000 in its original guise had been built in 1901, the Great Western engine was 2 years its junior, but the Midland engine went directly from service to a working retirement. Official photographs were taken at Wirksworth, the traditional place for Midland Railway photography. This second photographic session took place in front of the local schoolchildren, many of whom it was hoped would be railway roundabout viewers. The engine had been taken back to Derby to be turned to allow pictures of both sides. She was finished in the full glory of the Midland's Crimson Lake livery, with that railway's heraldic achievement on the cab sides, topped by the famous wyvern. Indeed, she was to rise like another mythical bird, the phoenix, when she returned to steam inside Derby's Roundhouse, preparatory to her first trial run from Derby to Leicester. These film shots were taken at slow speed, as the light was very low inside the Roundhouse. The trial run started from Derby Station. The man on the right is John Scholes, the first curator of the Clapham Museum for the British Transport Commission. The restoration of number 1000 was very much his project, and he was extremely particular in ensuring the magnificent finish was not harmed. The engine was coaled by hand and banned from passing under a coaling chute. Pat Whitehouse had the full cooperation of Derby on this trial run, and rode in the first coach. Leaning out of the window, he recalls that 3 people held his legs for these shots. The outward trial finished at Leicester Midland Station, and the locomotive was then turned and ran back to Derby, where it was, of course, originally built and rebuilt. The first notable rail tour was run to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of the Stephenson Locomotive Society, or SLS, which was founded in 1909, and the tour started at Birmingham New Street from the Midland's number 4 platform. The train ran north via Derby Midland, where it paused for photographs, and then carried on to the north via Ambergate, Clay Cross and Sheffield Midland Station, another photocall. The train's destination was York, where the locomotive was eventually to be housed at the National Railway Museum, which became the successor to Clapham. She was destined for a further spell of mainline working in the early 1980s, but is now retired again alongside the pride of York, the famous Mallard, which was still a mainline locomotive in 1959. Number 1000's mentor, John Scholes, was instrumental in drawing up the famous British Railways list of historical locomotives for eventual preservation, which of course included both number 1000 and Mallard. Today that list forms the backbone of the collection of the National Railway Museum at York, where these locomotives are preserved for the benefit of the nation, along with the railway roundabout films themselves, from which this series of programmes has been prepared. Scottish locomotives enjoyed their own preservation programme, which is based on Glasgow Transport Museum. In the late 1950s, a number of historical Scottish locomotives were preserved in working order and were used for a series of trains in connection with the 1959 Scottish Industries Exhibition, held alongside Kelvin Hall Station on the northwest side of Glasgow city centre. The first of the quartet of Scottish engines is the Caledonian Single, which is followed by the Great North of Scotland Railway 440 Gordon Highlander. A Stanier Coronation Pacific stands by at Glasgow Central as two other historic locomotives reverse out of the Caledonian's terminus. The Scottish quartet had been augmented by the Great Western City of Truro, making its furthest ever trip north, and a highly unusual pairing with the third Scottish locomotive, the North British 440 Glen Douglas. Glen Douglas was to spend more than 26 years in Glasgow Transport Museum after retirement in 1965, and was presented to Glasgow Corporation in 1966. In 1992, it was brought out again to be prepared for a further period of mainline running. City of Truro also enjoyed another period of mainline use from 1985 to 1992, and has been preserved as part of the national collection of the National Railway Museum at York. This historic locomotive had been credited with the first recorded speed in excess of 100 miles an hour on a run in April 1904. Perhaps one of the most elegant 440 designs of all was the Great North of Scotland Railway's Class F. One example was preserved as GNOS's number 49 Gordon Highlander. The engine had been repainted in July 1958 after withdrawal from operating stock, and for the next 7 years worked special trains in the company of the other Scottish preserved engines, which were all shedded at the ex-Caledonian Railway shed at Dawnzone. Caledonian single number 123 was a unique machine. It was obsolete before it was built, but was a one-off exhibition machine built in 1886 by the Glasgow firm of Nielsen and Company for an exhibition in the city at which it won a gold medal. It was based on the design of the then current Caledonian 440s, altered to have just a single driving axle. After the exhibition, it was sold to the Caledonian Railway and achieved further fame in the railway races to the north in 1888. It was withdrawn in 1935, but retained as it was the last single driver in service. It was returned to working order in the year of this film, 1959, and this was one of its first appearances. The final Scottish historical locomotive was the Highland Railway 460, or Jones Goods. This was the first 460 design in Great Britain and acquired its sobriquet after its designer's name. It was the first of a series of 15 engines numbered from 103 to 117 for the Highland, which later became part of the LMS. That railway withdrew the class between 1929 and 1940, but preserved this engine in view of its historical importance. It was originally painted in Highland Railway green, but when returned to traffic in 1959, it appeared in Stroudley yellow, a colour it sported for a short while after it was built. This exhibition was one of its earliest appearances after its return to use. It retired once again in 1965 and has not yet returned to work. One of Scotland's most famous routes is that from Fort William to Mallaig in the Western Highlands. It was comparatively recently built, opening in the early part of this century, and it opened up one of the most beautiful parts of the country to tourists. In the shadow of Ben Nevis, trains set off over the original West Highland line as far as Mallaig Junction, where they turned northeastwards towards Bernaby, where the railway crossed the Caledonian Canal, which connected Fort William to Inverness. The line to our left is a goods loop, serving an industrial siding near Corpac. The line ran alongside Loch Isle as it headed into the mountains. After leaving the Loch side, the line begins to climb towards Glenfinnan on gradients of between 1 in 50 and 1 in 60. The line twists and turns as it approaches the famous concrete viaduct at Glenfinnan, with numerous speed restrictions. Pat and John travelled on the train and by road to obtain these views, as part of their visit to the West Highlands when they were filming a pair of Glen 440s on the main line from Fort William to Glasgow in May 1959. Glenfinnan Viaduct is famous for being the first use of concrete in such a structure, built by Concrete Bob McAlpine. Note the fish vans at the back of the train. Glenfinnan was the first stop for this train. Here the train is approaching the top of the climb after Glenfinnan, the last part being 1 in 70. Loch Haylot was passed non-stop. The second important passing station is at Arisaig, after which the famous White Sands can be seen as the train turns to the north alongside the Atlantic Ocean. Mallaig is famous for its kippers, and fishing has always been its principal trade. The station is set alongside the small harbour where the hardy fishing fleet was moored. At this time, rail tracks led along the harbour's jetty, and fish traffic was an important source of revenue for the railway. Fish vans often ran in passenger trains, but always at the back. Mallaig's other seafaring business was the ferry trade to the Isle of Skye, operated by McBrain's Shipping Company, something of a Scottish institution. Back at the station, two of Sir Nigel Gresley's Class K2 moguls, a type long associated with the West Highland, stood ready to run back to Fort William, the engine on the left heading a fish train. This is a railway that still sees steam in the summer, as British Rail runs a regular steam-hauled train during the season from Fort William to Mallaig. Perhaps the most famous electric train of all was the Brighton Belle, the Southern Railway and later Southern Region's all-Pullman electric multiple unit train, which ran from London Victoria Station to Brighton. There were 3 5-car units for the Brighton Belle service, numbers 3051, 2 and 3. The Pullman Car Company's British workshops were at Brighton, so they were able to keep a watchful eye on them. The mechanical side of the trains were the responsibility of the Southern, whilst the passenger accommodation was Pullman's. The units were painted in the standard Pullman livery of chocolate and cream, elaborately lined out. First-class cars bore female names, whilst third and later second-class cars merely bore numbers. The Brighton Belle units were of both classes, the driving cars at each end being second class. The Pullman Car Company's income came from the supplementary fares charged, and for this the traveller was entitled to a reserved seat, service from uniformed attendants, and an at-the-seat meal service at all times. The train attracted a regular clientele, who became very attached to its old-world charm, based on Edwardian standards of travel, a jewel amongst the standardized electric trains that shared the Brighton route. The railway roundabout camera crew went to Brighton Station in 1959 to film the train at the height of its popularity. It had commenced running on the 1st of January 1933 as the Southern Belle, but the name was changed to Brighton Belle 18 months later. It continued to run until the 30th of April 1972, the only break being during the Second World War. The normal formation was 10 cars, the third unit being kept as standby. This also allowed the train to operate as normal when any one of the units was undergoing overhaul. Some off-peak services were formed of one unit only. They never ran any scheduled services other than the Brighton one throughout their careers, although they were occasionally used to form specials. Arrival at London Victoria was within an hour of leaving Brighton. 2 up and 2 down trains were run daily. All 15 Brighton Belle Pullman cars exist today. Some of them still work regularly out of Victoria Station in the British formation of the Venice Simplon Orient Express. Others are used as restaurants or as coaching stock on preserved railways. Many of the boys who watched Railway Roundabout were avid train spotters, or rather loco spotters, as their principal interest was in the steam locomotive, and collecting the numbers by recording them in the famous Ian Allan ABC Loco Spotters books was a huge hobby. The Ian Allan Loco Spotters Club was founded in the 1940s and had grown into a sizable organization by the 1950s. Many members harbored the ambition to become a driver. The club organized a number of rail tours over unusual routes or with unusual or special motive power and held club meetings. However, the ultimate thrill for the young loco spotter was a shed bash. Again, these were organized by the club, but many a railway enthusiast of today can recall the back ways in through broken fences, and perhaps the tip of the shed foreman's boot as they left the premises rapido. By dint of their good connections with British Railways, Patrick Whitehouse and John Adams were able to arrange shed visits on an official basis, and were able to bring the near legendary sheds to all the loco spotters in the country through the television medium. The ultimate legend of all, number 60022 Mallard, the fastest steam locomotive ever, was the first to be seen when the cameras were taken to King's Cross Shed in London. This was the principal metropolitan shed for the Eastern region and its forebears, the London and North Eastern Railway and Great Northern Railway, and it was always known colloquially as Top Shed. Note the corridor connection on the back of the tender. This was provided to allow a change of engine crew on the move on non-stop expresses to Newcastle and Edinburgh. Top Shed always had an allocation of Sir Nigel Gresley's streamlined A4 Pacifics, of which Mallard was the most famous. But at the time of this visit, the shed also was host to what is today the most famous steam engine in the world, Flying Scotsman. The LNER's first Pacific was still on top link work, and had recently been modified with a double blast pipe and chimney. It was later to have German-style smoke deflectors added, which further changed its appearance. Abbotsford was one of the post-war developments of LNER Pacifics, belonging to A.H. Peppercorn's A1 class. The next engine is one of Sir Nigel Gresley's V2 262 class, known as Green Arrows, after the Pioneer engine, which is preserved today. Although classified as mixed traffic, this V2 is painted in the full express passenger lime green livery. Another A4 is number 29 Woodcock, illustrating the immaculate condition of top-link locomotives. By contrast, the suburban tank of Class N2 is decidedly unkempt. Diesel shunters had already made an impact, as had the short-lived North British Type 1 diesel electrics used on King's Cross suburban services. By contrast, our next shed bash, also in the former London and North Eastern or LNER Railways territory, was to British Railways' latest high-tech shed at Thornaby on Teesside. This shed was located in the very cradle of railways, a little to the east of Stockton-on-Tees, and its principal function was to service the mineral and freight locomotives, which were the mainstay of the industrial North East. Former North Eastern Railway Class Q6080 tender engines formed the backbone of Thornaby's fleet. There were 120 engines in this class, the products of Darlington Works from 1913 to 1921. The reason for this visit was to film the brand new facilities which had been installed here in 1959. Even as late as this in the steam locomotive's career, British Railways still needed to invest in new infrastructure. Thornaby was the jewel in the steam railway's crown and was completely constructed in that brave New World's material, reinforced concrete. Overhead water gantries and underlit pits were borrowed from the latest American practice, and every effort had been made to make the environment of the shed as clean as possible. A very difficult thing to do in a place as inherently dirty as a steam locomotive shed. Such was the regard paid by BR to Railway Roundabout that a locomotive was provided to play to the cameras. Although BR was still building steam engines, just a few Class 9Fs remaining on order, it was to be a mere 8 years until all the Q6s had gone and Thornaby was declared redundant, although some of its facilities were adapted for use by diesels. The depot had two power-operated turntables. Traditionally, turntables were hand-operated or utilized the vacuum ejectors of locomotives. The shed itself was of the Roundhouse pattern, with another turntable serving radial stabling roads. This shed was to outlast steam, being finally demolished in the 1990s. Our final shed bash in 1959 takes us back to Birmingham, home of Railway Roundabout, and of the Midland Railway's Saltley shed. This was the largest shed in the Birmingham district, and was situated a short distance to the east of Birmingham New Street Station, alongside the Midland's main line to Derby in the north. In 1959, its allocation still included classic Midland designs, such as these 3F and 4F 060s, as well as the most modern motive power. The educational aspect of Railway Roundabout was not overlooked, and this Hughes Crab 260 Mogul was used to illustrate the driver's preparation duties. It was essential for a driver to learn and know every type of engine he would be driving, as he had to ensure that every oiling point was attended to, or else trouble would be just around the corner. Another locomotive was picked out at Saltley to illustrate a feature. This is one of British Railway's standard Class 5 460s, which had been built with Caprotti valve gear. This rotary action valve gear was the final steam locomotive development of any consequence in Great Britain, and might have become the standard form of gear if steam locomotives had had any further developments. The shed had a number of Stanya's 3-cylinder 460 5X or Jubilee class engines for mainline work to both Derby and Sheffield in the north and Bristol in the south. The shed itself was a double roundhouse and had both freight and passenger locomotives on its allocation. The Midland had a second Birmingham shed at Bourneville on the other side of New Street, which dealt with local passenger duties and freight. The principal LMS design of heavy freight engine was Sir William Stanya's Class 8F, a number of which were shedded here. For the heaviest duties, BR Standard Class 9F spaceships worked from Saltley. This was the third last steam engine to be built at Crewe Works, and numerically of the class, although Swindon was to continue to build them throughout 1959 and into 1960. Saltley's allocation worked through to Carlisle on overnight fast freights via Derby and Sheffield. Two earlier members of the class illustrate the only obvious alterations made to the design, the shape of the tender and the fitment of double chimneys to the last built engines. Our final 1959 feature returns us to those glorious summer days of our youth when the sun always shone and carefree holidays were easily available, or so it seems. In rural Devon, on the southern border of Dartmoor, the Great Western's West of England main line spawned a number of branch lines, of which that to Kingsbridge, at the head of the Salcombe River estuary, was perhaps the best known. The branch connected with the main line at Brent, and we open with a view of number 5558, which has just come up from the coast with the train and is running round. Our next view is at the second of three intermediate stations on the line at Ex-GER Bridge, where the camping coaches visited in 1958 are seen to the right. This was the only crossing point. Not as well was the station between Ex-GER Bridge and the terminus at Kingsbridge. It also boasted a camping coach in the goods yard. .5573, seen at Kingsbridge, was one of the later series of these 4500 tanks. There were two distinct versions, the earlier ones with flat-topped side tanks and the later version with sloping tanks, which gave them an increased working range. These tanks could take 1,300 gallons, whilst the earlier engines could carry only 1,000 gallons. There were 100 of these later engines, which were officially known as the 4575 class, whilst the earlier examples numbered 75 of class 4500. The yellow spot with the letter C on the cab side was the Great Western's route code and power classification system. The colour indicated over which routes the locomotives could work, yellow giving the widest route availability, with the exception of uncoloured, which could go anywhere. The power classification covered the letters A to E, E being the highest, but this doesn't mean the 4500s were particularly powerful, as the system took into account brake capacity as well as tractive effort. Green lined-out livery was an example of BR gilding the lily, as the engines were plain green in GW days. The coaches used on the branch trains were the Great Western's standard B-set coaches, two identical vehicles forming a train. Small destination boards can be seen on these above the doors. Back at Ex-GER Bridge, an earlier 4500 tank is on the train, followed by another of the 4575 type. The branch was the first choice of a group of enthusiasts wishing to preserve a West Country branch line when it was threatened with closure in 1963. But sadly, BR removed the track before agreement could be reached, and the Dart Valley line was saved instead. Our last shot is back at Brent, where a palm tree sums up the Great Western's image of the English Riviera.